right back on the election campaign now on BBC Two. Let's join Jo Coburn for a new week of the Daily Politics.
Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics. After a strong showing in the local elections last week, Theresa May is out on the general election campaign trail, restating her commitment to the Tories' so far failed target of reducing net migration to the tens of thousands. Jeremy Corbyn is focusing on health today, unveiling a fresh Labour pledge for free parking at NHS hospitals in England, paid for by increasing tax on private health insurance. The BBC announces plans for a televised election debate featuring 7 parties on May the 31st, but it won't feature Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn. We've got full details of the Beeb's special election programming.
And we're taking the mood box on the roads across the whole of the UK for the general election campaign. Today we're in Harlow in Essex.
All that in the next hour, and with us for the whole of the programme today are the former Attorney-General Dominic Grieve and the Shadow Foreign Office Minister Catherine West. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So lots to discuss, but before we get stuck into the British general election, let's take a look at the election across the Channel and the victory of centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron as the new President of France. In the second round runoff between Mr Macron and Front National leader Marine Le Pen, Mr Macron took 2/3 of the votes cast. Speaking last night outside the Louvre in the French capital, the President-elect said a new page was being turned in French history.
What we've done
depuis tant et tant de mois
for so many months,
n'a ni précédent ni
no
équivalent.
comparison, there's no equivalence to
Tout le
that.
monde nous disait
Everybody
que
was saying
c'était
to us
impossible.
it was impossible.
Mais ils ne connaissaient pas la France.
But they didn't know anything about France.
Victory speech there for Emmanuel Macron. And, I mean, it was a pretty impressive win for him, bearing in mind he hadn't been elected before. But will it be good for Britain and Brexit, Dominic Grieve?
I think, on the face of it, it must be a good thing to have a moderate and sensible president as President of France. Is it going to give us advantages in the Brexit negotiations? I rather doubt it. France will clearly look to its long-term national advantage. But some of that national advantage is bound up with ours. It is in the French interest to have good trading relations and a stable relationship with the United Kingdom. I would be very surprised if Monsieur Macron didn't understand that. And therefore, I would expect and hope that he's going to be reasonable in approaching the Brexit negotiations and look at those areas where French interest and our own, in fact, meet. And there's a longer-term security issue, which is of immense importance, and the French know this. The United Kingdom is their key security partner in the European context.
Although he says he wants to reform and look at the Le Touquet agreement. Of course, we'll come on to that in just a moment. Catherine West, how would Jeremy Corbyn, if he is Prime Minister after the general election, approach discussions, or how should he approach those discussions with Emmanuel Macron?
Well, first to say how much I enjoyed the motto Ensemble la France. That's what we're all seeking, isn't it? Some kind of consensus, some sort of bringing together of everybody in the national interest or indeed Europe's interest. And that's the key thing about the negotiations, to search out what are the things that we need to do together and focus on those rather than megaphone diplomacy.
Although Mr Macron himself has warned in the past that the UK can expect no concessions in the Brexit negotiations. Now he's elected, we'll see if he sticks to that. And he said he would hold a rigid line on access to the EU single market and powers of the European Court.
I think what gets said in election campaigns and what we actually do in negotiations with a cool head matters. That's why Keir Starmer would be so good as our front person in the negotiations, because he's got a really good background in negotiations, in the legal framework, and he would be fantastic as our #1 negotiator.
Well, we're looking at pictures now of Emmanuel Macron, the president-elect, and François Hollande, the outgoing president of France, meeting there at a World War II memorial. You mentioned security, Dominic Grieve. I mentioned the Le Touquet agreement. That allows, of course, British customs officers to check passports in Calais. Is that agreement at risk?
It's clearly, on the basis of what he said, is something he wishes to review. And it's true that the agreement, which at the time appeared to be mutually advantageous to both countries, has turned out in reality, because of the arrival of such large numbers of immigrants into the Schengen area, to be of particular advantage to the United Kingdom and to be difficult for the French.
But it would be bad, of course, if it went for the British, wouldn't it?
It would be very bad if it went for us. At the same time, it would also create massive problems in terms of movement of people between our two countries. And even outside of the EU, we need to be able to facilitate that. So I'm not horribly pessimistic about the future of the Le Touquet agreement, but there's absolutely no doubt that one of the consequences of Brexit, which was predicted at the time, was that this would come up for review and that the French would probably take a different view about it than they did pre-Brexit and pre the referendum. So I think it's inevitable that that too is going to go into the mix of our bilateral relations, but it's worth bearing in mind it isn't linked directly to the EU at all.
And just briefly, he has been pretty shameless, Emmanuel Macron, in his ambition to lure French workers and money back to France. As you know, there are many French workers here. I think London, they say, is the 4th biggest city in France.
Well, just quickly on the Le Touquet agreement, we remember the chaos around Dover last year, straight after the referendum. And I'm afraid if we don't have a plan and if we don't get our ducks lined up in a row and stop the megaphone diplomacy and think about the facts, we could end up with a similar situation. But on the question of, the finance sector and so on, due to Brexit, I believe that we've lost hundreds of people who work in the financial sector already, and as a London MP, that's something which concerns me.
All right.
I'd like to get them back.
Let's leave it there for the moment. Now, it's time for our daily quiz. And the question for today is all about Tim Farron, the Lib Dem leader, who has revealed that as a boy he had a poster in his bedroom of a rather unusual political icon. So who was his political pin-up? Was it A, Che Guevara, B, Jacques Delors, C, Arthur Scargill, or D, Margaret Thatcher? And at the end of the show, Dominic and Catherine have an opportunity to give us an answer, hopefully the correct one. Now, throughout the general election campaign, we'll be getting political insight from two top political journalists. Today, we're joined by Christopher Hope of The Telegraph and the political commentator Martha Gill. I'm sure you're going to live up to that great hosting of the two of you. Welcome to the programme.
Hi.
So let's talk about the campaign. What sort of campaign is it going to be, like Christopher Hope? Is it going to be battle buses? Are there going to be morning conferences? How will it feel?
I think no, apart from the Lib Dems and UKIP are doing press conferences, but not every single morning. We've seen Lib Dems have got their big yellow battle bus. We're yet to see a Tory one or a Labour one, and it's quite hard for me and Martha to get onto them. And normally it's basically a few key camera crews and a wire service, and that's about it. So we're left trying to scramble to get where they're going to be and sort of cut them off at the pass. So I think we'll have more control than ever with this short campaign.
Right, and Martha Gill, what will you be doing then? Chris has made some suggestions. How will you keep tabs, hold their feet to the fire?
Well, it's difficult, really. Particularly with the Tories, their whole campaign is incredibly controlled. It's all about Theresa May. There's really been no difference between the local and the general election, I think, in that respect. The local and general election have been exactly the same and all about Theresa May and her message. Labour just looks slightly disorganised. I mean, I think probably what's going to happen is local candidates are going to distance themselves a bit from Jeremy Corbyn. That's what we saw had the most success in the local election,
right.
And the Lib Dems are just going to try as hard as they can to push that anti-Brexit message.
All right, well, let's talk about some of the issues, namely immigration and the target that the Tories look as if they may well restate in terms of bringing net migration down to tens of thousands. Before I come to you, let's just have a listen to what Theresa May had to say in Harrow.
It is important that we continue, and we will continue to say that we do want to bring net migration down to sustainable levels. We believe that is the tens of thousands. And of course, once we leave the European Union, we will have the opportunity to ensure that we have control of our borders here in the UK, because we'll be able to establish our rules for people coming from the European Union into the UK. That's a part of the picture we haven't been able to control before, and we will be able to control it. And leaving the EU means that we won't have free movement as it has been in the past.
Theresa May, Chris Hope, so they're going to go for it again. I mean, the Tories have not been able to get anywhere near that pledge of bringing net migration down to tens of thousands. So is it going to be third time lucky?
It's not the Tories, it's Theresa May as Home Secretary failed to do it during her time as Home Secretary.
Indeed.
And now as Prime Minister. It's on her watch, this whole thing. It's a big weakness for Theresa May, but it's a problem trying to get to a net figure when you don't know how many people are going to leave the country. The net figure is when you take off the numbers leaving and those coming back. And that's why, coming here I should say, and that's why it's so hard to hit it. And that's why there's been a bit of debate. Amber Rudd saying yesterday that she thought the figure wouldn't be the same as the last one, and now the Tories today slapping her down saying no, it's going to be the same one. But I think more interesting also is Theresa May in that press conference you played there is going to be discussing the Touquet agreement with President Macron from France, which is very interesting. Now the big deal there is where does the jungle camp go, on the north of France or in Kent? In fact, it's on the table again. Could be a problem for Theresa May.
Let's talk about freedom of movement, because also in that press conference there, Theresa May said it won't be freedom of movement as we know it. She has said similar things before. So what do you think will come in its place, Martha?
It's hard to say at this point. I mean, the fact that she's stuck by that 100,000 figure from 2010 sort of indicates that she's very willing to tie herself up, tie her hands, you know, in order to not to rock the Brexiteer vote at the moment. So that 100,000 figure was an albatross around David Cameron's neck. A lot of people said it was the biggest mistake he ever made. And Theresa May is falling into exactly the same trap, which is moreover going to become more toxic with Brexit. While people watch that figure, it's going to be something that the globalists in her party and the localists can really fight over. But she's willing to take that risk so as to really ensure this election doesn't get any Brexiteer votes, doesn't lose any Brexiteer votes. So on freedom of movement, you can expect her to sort of go in a similar direction at the moment.
All right. Well, let's look at health, because that was Labour's chosen issue today.
Yes.
They were talking about a range of things, but actually, in the end, perhaps the most eye-catching is this idea of free NHS hospital parking. Let's just have a listen to Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader.
If you visit a hospital because you want to look after an elderly relative or give support to a friend or go there in an emergency, I don't think you should be charged for doing so. I've just been talking also to a group of nurses, some of whom are community nurses and therefore have to go to different hospitals at different times. Others come in to do night shifts, difficult times when there's no public transport available. They need to be able to park their car. Unfortunately, in many cases, they have to pay for the privilege of parking at a place of work where they have to be, and they've had the frozen pay for the past 7 years. And so we think it's absolutely right that going to a hospital shouldn't incur an additional charge. In reality, it's a charge on sickness.
Jeremy Corbyn there. Well, Martha, that'll be popular, won't it?
I mean, yeah, sure. It'll... oh, sorry, I can just hear my voice echoing back in. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sure, it will be popular. It plays very well to Labour's key voters. You know, no more charges for parking, but hitting people who can afford private insurance. However, it's going to come under the same criticism as many of Labour's policies have and do, which is this really going to cover the costs? Parking fines and charges have funded a huge amount of filled a huge amount of gaps in the NHS. Is this really something we want to lose?
Yeah, it's more than that though. It's also it's punishing any kind of aspiration. I think people try and work hard. They want to pay their taxes for healthcare, fund the wonderful NHS, but also maybe pay money into an insurance scheme to allow them to go to the doctor when they want to. I think this policy is going to be quite damaging for any kind of aspiration. It's more playing to the base by Jeremy Corbyn. It's not reaching out. I mean, parking charges have been a big issue. Many of a splash were written in the Telegraph about how it seems so unfair that you're taxed to go and see a relative or get treatment in a hospital. But I do think it's a tax on aspiration, and that's the problem he's got there.
Right, let's briefly talk about the TB debates, because we know that Theresa May has said she won't do a leaders' debate in terms of debating head-to-head with Jeremy Corbyn. Do you think more pressure will come on her, Chris Hope, over the campaign?
I think so. I mean, I think this idea with the BBC announcing it, I think at lunchtime today, about having a couple of question time situations, say the audience or voters questioning each leader individually, is not going to wash very well. I think people want to see a bit of a toe-to-toe combat. It looks like Theresa May so far has won this battle with the BBC. There'll be a 7-strong sort of main front bencher debate rather than the lead debate. I think ITV are going to have a go at doing leaders debates, and that's good luck to them. I think our readers, voters, viewers want to see a bit of hand-to-hand combat, and that's what they're not going to get if Theresa May gets her way.
All right. Thank you to both of you. Enjoy the campaign. Let's pick up on some of those points that were discussed there. Talking on this issue of freedom of movement. If it's not going to be freedom of movement as we know it now, what are the alternatives, the feasible alternatives in your mind?
I think we're going to have to wait and see how this is developed out, because there are a number of different options.
What would you prefer?
Well, clearly, when you consider our European partners, there's great desirability that people should be able to come in and out of the United Kingdom. We're not about to impose visas on tourists coming over to visit Westminster Abbey, and there are millions of them who are coming over from Europe at any given moment.
So we're going to have people coming from the EU working here, obviously?
Well, not necessarily, because if you have a work permit system after we have left the EU, then you are able to regulate the number of work permits you give out. The desirability of reducing overall net migration, I have absolutely no doubt about it, because if you look at the pressure it's placed on communities and also on infrastructure and services, it's very real in those places where they're most concentrated. But it's also right to say that achieving that reduction is going to be very challenging.
And it's going to be very challenging to achieve that 10,000 or tens of thousands pledge to bring down net migration. I mean, it hasn't been done anything like it. Do you think it's sensible to restate it?
Well, we had net migration in the tens of thousands back in the 1990s. Right. I mean, so it hasn't
been achieved though since this pledge has come into play, has it?
You're absolutely right. Successive governments have indicated a desire to reduce the levels of migration and have not been able to achieve that figure. Now, with leaving the EU, the options for doing it are undoubtedly increased, because the freedom of movement, which is linked to EU membership, goes. But it's still going to be a considerable challenge. But I don't criticise the Prime Minister for coming along and making it an aspiration and indicating that
it is an aspiration.
To seek to reduce it to those levels.
And probably fail again if the past record is anything to go by. Can we just pick up on health, Labour's health policy?
Could I just respond on that?
Very briefly, yes, go on.
I'll be really quick. 3 very quick points. 1 is broken promise. 2 is Labour would move towards allowing all EU nationals to remain on the first day of the government.
That's your unilateral pledge?
It is. And number 3, please take students out of that silly target, because it's breaking our university system, which is one of our biggest exports.
Why isn't that happening? I mean, almost everybody seems to think it would be the right thing to do to take students out of that target.
I think there's a double problem. Firstly, internationally, the measure of migration includes students, something I've always found rather surprising. I rather agree that I don't think the public are concerned at the number of students coming into this country, as long as the number of students coming in are not, in fact, a fuel of long-term migration. But the difficulty the government has is that to depart from an internationally recognised norm is going to attract criticism. And I suspect that's one of the reasons why the Prime Minister has been very reluctant to do it.
All right, well, let's talk briefly about health, because as well as the free parking charges, Labour wants to ban junk food advertising during the X Factor. They want to obviously tackle obesity. It's hardly revolutionary, is it? And although popular, if you go ahead with that proposal to stop car parking charges, again, it hasn't been costed.
So many people who are ill are facing this extra cost every single time they go to the hospital. And I think this is the sort of thing which Labour can do. It's not extremely expensive, it's doable.
How much is it?
It's between 160 and 190 million. It is doable. And I think that that's the correct thing to do to help people, particularly the staff who are running out of appointments in order to, put more pennies into the meter. We've got to have something workable here. Not only are nurses going to food banks, they've also got to stump up all this extra money because they're on consultancy arrangements where they don't know which hospital they're going to be at from one day to the next.
Right.
And that just seems to me something which we could sort overnight. But the government has failed to do so up to now.
Let's move on. With just over 4 weeks to go until the general election on June the 8th, the main party's tax plans are becoming a little clearer. So what do we know so far? Well, Labour have put forward a so-called personal tax guarantee. This means that under a Labour government, there would be no rises in the standard rate of VAT, personal national insurance contributions, or income tax on those earning less than £80,000 a year, which is 95% of taxpayers. However, the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell said yesterday that people earning above £80,000 a year would have to pay a modest bit more. The Conservatives have so far refused to say whether or not they will repeat the so-called triple tax lock. This was a promise not to raise income tax, VAT or national insurance, which they made at the last general election in 2015. In a recent interview, Theresa May said, "We won't be increasing VAT," but she didn't make a similar promise for either income tax or national insurance. Meanwhile, the Liberal Democrats have said that they would raise all rates of income tax by 1%. They say this would raise £6 billion, and that money would be ring-fenced for the NHS and social care. The party's leader, Tim Farron, said the money was needed to rescue the NHS. Well, let's take a look at what the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, had to say about Labour's tax policy yesterday.
What we're saying today, anyone earning below £80,000, we'll be guaranteeing you will not have an increase in income tax or VAT or national insurance contributions. And for those above £80,000, we're asking them to pay a modest bit more. Why? To fund our public services. You had Theresa May on last week, Andrew. If I just make this point, you put that very good question to her about nurses. 11% cut in wages over the last 7 years, some of them having to go to food banks, our nurses. That cannot be right. So we're going to ask those higher earners just to pay a bit more.
The Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. Well, we've been joined to discuss the party's tax promises by the Liberal Democrat Dick Newby. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Catherine West, first of all. Labour has promised not to raise personal national insurance contributions. Is it therefore possible that the party will raise employers' national insurance contributions?
Well, we'll have to wait till the manifesto comes out, but what's clear is two things. Number one, Labour will be much tougher on the corporations. We know that between 2011 and 2015, Thames Water, one of our biggest infrastructure companies, paid zero corporation tax.
And what will you do about that?
So we will make sure that the corporations pay their tax. Why should we pay our tax?
Yes.
And they pay zero.
I'm sure you get a lot of support for that, but how will you make them pay the tax?
We will change the legislation, which the Tories have had 7 years to do and failed to do. They have failed to crack down on corporations paying zero of their tax. So in a way, you can set the rate at whatever you like, but if you've allowed a loophole, such as what's developed under the Tory government, then large infrastructure companies like Thames Water, who charge pensioners over the odds for their bills, are then getting away with paying zero. So the real question is, how are we going to actually get the money out of the system which exists already but which is going offshore?
And what rate of corporation tax? You say the rates don't matter, but you do want to reverse any cuts in corporation tax. So what rate is the party going to set it at?
Well, that will be announced in the manifesto, but the important thing is not really the rate, it's that they pay it. Because what was the rate between 2011 and 2015 which they paid zero on? That's the real injustice, Joe, and that's the one that we've got to crack down on.
Very briefly, because I want to go through the tax policies.
But this is getting hooked on a complete sideline.
Why?
Because whilst it may, the question as to the legal framework of corporation tax, yes, it may well be relevant, and I'm certainly in favour of closing loopholes.
Voters won't be pleased if they're finding out that corporations are not paying their share of corporation
tax.
tax.
The chances of that having a significant impact on revenue is negligible. The reality is that by cutting corporation tax, the Conservative government has raised the amount that you get through corporation tax because the economy has grown.
Right.
And this is precisely what Labour will attack and, I'm afraid, undermine, because they've never had a coherent economic policy and their taxation policies always have the consequence of reducing economic growth.
They seem to be clear here on the tax policy. Let's talk about VAT, because Labour's promised not to raise the standard rate of VAT. So again, do you think that leaves open the chance of raising the reduced rate of VAT, which is paid on things, for example, like energy?
Well, talking about energy, big infrastructure company like Thames Water, let's look at the energy companies and see how much tax they pay.
But these are about Labour's tax policies and what is being promised here.
It's about our priorities. Our priority is not that your average person who's walking down Millbank today is paying more tax. It's about getting the corporations which are greedy and taking all that they can out of the asset stripping, and you have to agree with me on this, that the government has done nothing on the big companies to crack down on them. They can pay much more than what your average person can pay.
And so in John McDonnell's minds, can people earning over £80,000? He said a modest bit.
He's going to protect 95% of the working population.
Right, but how much money is that actually going to bring in?
That will be revealed in the manifesto.
Right. I mean, of course, these things are going to be revealed in the manifesto, but when promises like this are made, people do want to know that they're going to net the amount of money that you say is going to come into the Treasury.
Crack down on the business, and yet Thames Water paid zero corporation tax between 2011 and 2015. How can that be fair?
All right, Dominic Grieve, let's look at the tax pledges so far from the Conservatives, because there was this triple tax lock not to raise the three main taxes. And then, of course, Philip Hammond did exactly the opposite and did try to raise national insurance contributions class 4. Why should anybody trust what you're saying in your manifesto?
Well, I hope the manifesto will avoid detailed pledges, because everything that I've ever seen shows that you have an intention, which is that we're a low-tax party and we have been consistent in trying to achieve that for everybody. But that if you start making detailed promises, particularly at a time of economic turbulence linked to our departure from the European Union, you're likely to saddle yourself with potential problems. So I'll read the manifesto with interest.
But you wouldn't want to see a lock.
In my view, I think that locks are probably undesirable. And
Except if voters are making a decision, swing voters deciding who to vote for, and Labour has said they won't raise national insurance, VAT or income tax for 95% of people. Your party has only said so far they won't raise VAT. Then you should vote Labour if you want a lower tax.
Well, I think the first thing to look at is Labour's costings.
Well, hang on. We're looking at the taxes. We're looking at the taxes, Dominic Green.
They've got a 45 billion hole in their financial projections. Where are they going to fill it from? They've either got to borrow that money, which will be catastrophic, or they've got to raise taxes, which will be equally bad. So I'm afraid I wouldn't believe a word that the Labour manifesto says on this.
Right, but as I said, when we were talking about taxes, you promised not to increase national insurance contributions, and as I say, Philip Hammond tried to do exactly that. It was also the same in 2010. David Cameron said there wouldn't be an increase in VAT. Up went VAT. So there is trust issues on both sides. But in terms of being a voter who wants to go for the party offering the least in terms of taxes or a tax burden, Labour is going to be that party so far.
I wouldn't have thought so. We've taken 4 million people out of tax, lowered tax for 4 million people. We have reduced the number of people, we've taken lots of numbers of people out of tax altogether. And the combination of raising tax thresholds and the living wage is likely to benefit those who are the poorest. So for those reasons, my view is everybody should actually trust the Conservative government over this, because its record on this is extremely good.
And what will you do about Thames Water, which is paying zero
hang on, we've already
tax?
mentioned Thames Water. It's just one company, and we're talking broadly about the tax proposals.
Just one example.
Dick Newby, your party wants to raise all rates of income tax by 1% to fund the NHS. That's a very clear policy. Is it fair, though, to raise all rates by the same percentage, whether you're a basic rate taxpayer or a higher rate taxpayer?
Well, the great thing about income tax generally is it's the most fair tax. On this policy, it means that a nurse, for example, will pay an extra £3 or £4 quid a week, but somebody on £250,000 will be paying an extra £2,500 a year. I mean, this is a fair way of dealing with a national crisis. The other parties admit there's a problem, but actually haven't come up with a way of dealing with it, because the Labour proposal is frankly incredible. You can't get 6 billion quid out of people who earn over £80,000 a year, because, as we know, once you put tax rates up, headline tax rates up, they stop paying it.
And that's the problem, isn't it, Catherine? It's symbolic, because the modest rate, in fact, why is John McDonnell being so timid, if you like? He's not going to raise anything like £6 billion, which Dick Newby says the increase that he will put forward for his party will, in terms of putting money into the NHS. Yours won't raise very much, but it will, of course, put a bit more burden on the people you'd like to hit.
They've had 7 years to deal with the rip-off companies which take so much money out of our economy day in and day out.
But that's not what John McDonnell's saying, as I understand it, is where most of the money's coming from.
Which party is more likely to crack down on Labour?
But
they've had 7 years to do it and failed to do it.
What is this going to raise? This seems to me to be a complete diversion. It's a piece of displacement activity. I'm the first to accept that if there's tax avoidance and you can properly close down the loophole, you should do it.
So why haven't
but to translate that into somehow this is going to lead to massive sums of money, which is going to fund Labour's 45 billion black hole, I think is fanciful.
Right. What is the £45 billion black hole? What is that actually going on? What's it referring to?
Well, they referred to a whole range of things that they say they wish to finance more, and which, on the face of it, when you total up the aggregate promises, come to that figure. Now, they may change as the campaign goes on. They may start to clarify where that is. But you aggregate it up, and there is the figure.
Right.
And John McDonnell has not explained that. There's been a series of promises about more money for everything. And let's face it. Well, I mean, I'm the first to accept that in any society with public services, you can find a justification for spending more on everything.
And many people will find a lot of those policies very popular, particularly if they feel that there is a crisis, for example, in social care and in the NHS,
but if
and more money.
Economy economy is wrecked in the process,
The
that
truth
money
is-
will never
the
come.
The truth is the Tories have borrowed twice as much as both Labour governments put together between 97 and 2010. From 2010 to 2007, they've borrowed an awful lot of money. So you're trying to make out that Labour...
objection to that.
Well, hang on. As usual, the Lib Dems are attacking Labour.
Well, hang on. Let him make his...
you were in coalition together.
Let Dick Newby make his point.
And you both failed to deal with tax avoidance.
No, we didn't actually fail to deal with tax
Well, why did
avoidance.
Hang on, let Dick Newby
corporation tax?
Answer that direct
I think
point.
the
2011 and
technical question
2015.
is that because of the high levels of investment that Thames Water have made, they offset that against their tax liability. Now, if you're saying you want to change...
corporation taxes
hang on.
I thought that was separate from,
well,
from
it's
the
quite
investment
interesting.
tax.
Corporation tax in the last financial year went up significantly, and why was the principal reason? Because people invested less. Now, if you want that to happen, that's fine, but there's no easy, huge bucks out of big companies.
All right, hang on, because we need to move on.
And then you need to have incentives for investment. And at the moment, they're all mixed and muddled. And the corporations, which happen also to be the Tory donors on the whole, they are the ones who are making a lot of money.
You've made your point, Catherine, on that. I need to ask Dick Newby about something else. The Conservatives have sent out a press release today which includes a secret recording of Vince Cable, your new Treasury spokesman, suggesting that in some cases Lib Dem supporters should vote for the Labour Party. Do you support that?
I think voters everywhere are going to make up their minds what is the most important to them. If the most important thing to them is Brexit, and if they've got a hard Brexit Conservative and a strong, moderate Labour candidate who is a strong Remainer, it wouldn't surprise me that they voted for that Labour candidate.
But
if it was a
should
seat,
the Lib Dems be encouraging it as official party policy?
No, I think it's up to everybody to make their own mind up in the seat where they live.
Right, so you wouldn't want to adopt it as the party policy, as it seems that Vince Cable would like to see?
It's for everybody to decide in the seat where they live, in the absence of PR, who they think best represents their interests.
All right, Dick Newby, thank you very much. Now, in the last hour, the BBC has announced the details of its special election programming. And here's how it all lines up. Mishal Hussain will chair the BBC election debate on Wednesday the 31st of May, a seven-way debate on policy involving senior spokespeople from the Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrat, SNP, Plaid Cymru, Green Party and UKIP parties. 2 days later, on Friday, the 2nd of June, David Dimbleby will present a Question Time Leaders special live from York, featuring Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn. And on Sunday, the 4th of June, leaders Tim Farron and Nicola Sturgeon will take part in a second Question Time special, also live from Edinburgh on BBC One. Plaid Cymru's Leanne Wood and UKIP's Paul Nuttall will also face questions that Sunday in separate programmes from Swansea and Bristol, respectively. The final debate before the election will be a Newsbeat youth debate in Manchester on Tuesday the 6th of June, where leading Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat, SNP, Plaid Cymru, Green and UKIP politicians will face questions in front of an audience of 16 to 34-year-olds. Elsewhere, Andrew Neil will be presenting a series of one-on-one interviews with Theresa May, Jeremy Corbyn, Tim Farron, Paul Nuttall and Nicola Sturgeon throughout the week of the 22nd of May. I do hope you've got all that. We've been joined by the BBC's head of news gathering and elections supremo, Jonathan Munro. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Now, there are reports today that Philip May will be appearing alongside Theresa May on The One Show tomorrow night. Is that true?
Yes, it is true, actually. Mr and Mrs May will be on the sofa at 7 o'clock tomorrow night, and there'll be other interviews with party leaders on The One Show. It's not part of the whole debate strategy, that was rather separate, but yes, that's true.
Right, and what about Jeremy Corbyn's wife?
Well, it's up to Mr and Mrs Corbyn about whether they want to appear as a couple or not. The invitation has certainly been extended. OK,
let's talk about the debates. The seven-way debate on the 31st of May that I just mentioned involving all the major parties, but it's trailed that senior spokespeople will be taking part, not the leaders. Why not?
Well, Theresa May announced a couple of things after the Easter weekend, didn't she? Number one, there'll be a general election, and number two, she wouldn't be taking part in any television debate. So we went into a process of piecing together a plan for our programmes, knowing that the Prime Minister was not going to appear in that format.
So you accepted it right there and decided not to work for it?
We asked officials in Downing Street whether that was likely to change. We were told on several occasions no. So we had a position that was pretty clear. The Prime Minister decided, as is perfectly within her rights, not to take part in the programmes. So our discussion then was about whether we do it for the seven-hander or whether we do a so-called leaders' debate, eliminating the governing party and the Prime Minister.
Right. I mean, there were leaders' debates, as you know, in 2010 and 2015. Are you letting the Prime Minister off the hook by not going ahead with a leaders' debate and empty chairing her?
Well, we don't really believe in the empty chair, because the empty chair is a tactic to sort of embarrass someone to come and talk to us. And actually, I'm not sure that's in the interest of the audience. What we try to do is to put together a format that's in the interest of the audience, who are in large part also the electorate. And if you're dealing with issues from Brexit to the health service to immigration or whatever, surely the interests of the audience are best served by hearing all the cases from the parties they can vote for. And if you're saying that because one leader or two leaders have taken a decision not to take part, you'll eliminate that argument from the picture, I don't think that's in the interests of the audience overall.
Although ITV is saying that they have extended invitations to the leaders of those 7 parties, and they will run that leaders' debate on whoever replies.
Well, the leaders are very welcome to turn up for ours, and they know that. And I think we'll have a mixed bag. I think there'll be some leaders and some non-leaders from the various parties. ITV have made their own perfectly legitimate decision. It's not the conclusion we came to.
Right. Anybody confirmed yet for that debate?
There's a few people confirmed, but what we've said to the parties is until all the cast list is confirmed, we won't go public with that.
And the challengers debate that happened in 2015 involved Ed Miliband and the other opposition parties. Why are you not doing that again?
Well, again, I don't think it was really in the interest of the audience in retrospect, because you didn't hear from the governing parties. There were 2 governing parties at the time, obviously, in the coalition, neither of whom were on the stage. And it was part of quite a complicated balance with other programmes around Question Time and so on. This time we found a different and I think better solution, given the circumstances that the Prime Minister's chosen not to do it.
You don't think if more pressure is brought to bear that eventually Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, if there was an opposition debate, would be forced to turn up?
You know, the freedom of speech comes with the freedom not to speak. And if political leaders decide for whatever reason, and we've not discussed the reasons, it's up to the parties and it's up to the voters also to interpret the reasons. If they've chosen not to take part, we're not really into strong-arming people into the studio. We want people to come to debate who want to debate.
What do you think? Is she still running scared, Theresa May?
I don't think she's running scared at all. Listening to what's just been said, I think the format sounds to me to be very interesting.
Well, of course, because she's not under extended pressure to come.
Well, I think the point for me is, are you going to get a discussion? I personally have never found the gladiatorial contests which we've had very helpful.
It worked very well in the presidential debate that we've just had between Macron and Marine Le Pen.
But we are not a presidential state.
So says Theresa May. Me, myself and I in this election. She's made it very presidential between herself and Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, we don't have a presidential system, and I don't want to see one in this country. Therefore, I prefer to see a system where you actually grill spokesmen fully and there's proper debate. And I'm not sure that you need, in fact, I'm sure in my own mind that there's better ways of doing it than having the gladiatorial contests.
What about Jeremy Corbyn?
I suppose it all comes down to Linton in the end, doesn't it? What does
You're talking about Linton Crosby, who's organising it. Well, no doubt Jeremy Corbyn also has strategists behind the campaign. But why is he not taking part,
For the first time ever, we have a very independent-minded person
who doesn't want to take part in debates either.
Who actually wants to do it, provided that it's fair, and fair is meaning the 2 top people.
But why doesn't he do the opposition debate, Ed Miliband?
Well, why doesn't he go up against, 77% of people apparently are going to choose between the 2 main parties. So why not have both up there? It's all about brinkmanship. And I think, the key thing is if Jeremy said yes, then everybody would say, well, where's Mrs May? And I think, the important thing is that we get to hear, within our own context of Parliament and so on, but that we get to hear them, because now that there's no more PMQs, we're not getting that sort of weekly.
What do you think of that idea put forward by Catherine?
I think that the key things here are what's in the interest of the audience, and are we going to see the party leaders, particularly those who will be leading big blocks of numbers of MPs, interact with real people on live television.
So the question time debate.
Absolutely, and this time around we've made a couple of changes to that format. Both the Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn will have longer than leaders did in the 2015 election.
Oh, so how long is it going to be?
45 minutes each rather than half an hour each. And we've included the SNP in that format, which we didn't do in 2015, to reflect the fact that in the Parliament that's just dissolved, they were a much, much bigger presence than they have been previously. And I think both those things actually are in the interest of the audience.
Thank you very much for coming in. Jonathan Munro. After last week's local election results, which saw the Conservatives make gains across the country and Labour slip back, the line from both party leaders was that there's still everything to play for when it comes to the general election. So, could there be a big switch in the way people vote in 4 weeks' time? Here's Adam.
Welcome to Harlow, celebrating 70 years since it was designated as a new town. In last week's elections for the County Council, the Conservatives made big gains. There were small losses for Labour and the Liberal Democrats and big losses for UKIP. But when it comes to the general election, will people vote the same way or will they change their minds? Can I ask, how did you vote in the council elections last week?
No.
Oh, OK. Well, let's put it another way. Are you going to vote for the same party in the general election?
Yes.
But your political allegiance will remain secret.
Exactly.
You two look like you've got a strong sense of civic duty. Did you vote in the local elections last week? Oh, you actually don't then. OK. Can I ask who you voted for?
Conservative.
Are you going to vote Conservative on the June the 8th?
Yes.
OK. Grab a ball and pop it in the same box then. Would you vote on different issues for the council compared to if it was a general election?
Yes.
Road, the schools, the car parks, just the town centre, policies on the town centre, on housing.
So you're in like a different headspace
Yeah,
when it comes to the local elections?
Yeah.
OK. Did you vote in the council elections last week? No? OK. Did anyone vote in the council elections? Vote in the local elections last week? No? OK.
I do believe that everybody should vote.
Well, the turnout here was 35% last week. Does that make you ashamed to be
It
an
does.
Essex
It
person?
does.
Oh, what have you got? Is that a fidget spinner? So basically you just do that. Is that it? Is that what all the fuss is about these things? Right, I've had a tip off. There's a comic convention happening down there. Too good an opportunity to miss. Did you vote at the local election?
No, I wasn't here.
Were you on some planet somewhere?
Somewhere in the galaxy.
Do you think people should vote the same in the local elections
They
as
should
they do?
vote to ban Christmas.
Mr. Joker voting green at the general election?
Got to go with the hair colour.
Yeah.
I think pretty much the council elections will be it's almost a precursor to the general election.
Like a bellwether.
Definitely,
like
yeah.
a preview. A trailer for the main
unless
film.
there's an earthquake of change.
I just want it for the Brexit to go through without any opposition.
Jeremy Corbyn and his team, they don't seem to come over very well.
But you're still going to vote Labour?
I am.
Right, even though it might not make any difference?
Yeah, because you have to keep voting and hopefully sometime it will turn around.
So we've got a few switchers, but the majority of people say they're going to vote the same way as they did last Thursday. Thanks, Harlow.
Looked like he had fun. Adam Fleming reporting, and we've been joined by Joe Twyman from the opinion pollster YouGov. So, following on from our scientific mood box, is that the case in terms of the evidence that you have that most people will vote the same from local to general?
No, well, there are two dimensions to this. There's the vote choice, but then there's also the decision to vote or not. Those are the two interesting questions that we have to answer as pollsters. And what we've seen previously is that there's a lot of churn between local and general elections, particularly when they're so close to each other like this. You go back to 1983, Labour enjoyed just 3 points behind the Conservatives in the local elections. There, a month later in the 1983 election, there was 16 points behind. So things have the potential to
So not a happy historical precedent then for Labour if you're choosing 83.
Or indeed any opposition.
Right, and in 87 was it?
87, similarly, the Conservatives gained 5% in the month between the locals and the general.
Right, I mean, on that basis and looking at the recent performance by Labour, you'll be desperately hoping people will be switching, won't you, between local and general?
The big question is the UKIP vote, isn't it? Because Mrs May does seem to have responded by wrapping herself in the UKIP flag, which is, I think, what one of the UKIP commentators said on the day that the BBC did the coverage on last Friday.
And does that explain Labour's poor performance?
It does explain her announcement today on immigration. Really
but what
trying
about Labour's performance?
to tack towards the UKIP sort of voters to try and keep them on board. And I think for Labour we've got some very good promises around the £10 minimum wage. You see, that could actually transform a lot of people's lives.
Switches between UKIP and Labour, rather than, of course, what many commentators feel was a wholesale switch from UKIP to the Conservatives?
Well, the data shows that between half and two-thirds of people who voted UKIP the last election are moving over to the Conservatives, which helps to explain why they're perhaps higher in the polls than we've had previously. But the point is that we still have an entire campaign left and things can change. Back in 2010, and I know you were talking about TV debates previously, back in 2010, the Lib Dems jumped 10 points in a week. Now, that was as a result of Cleggmania. I agree with Nick in the first televised debate.
And it fell back, of course.
And, well, it fell back a bit, but the point is that substantial change can happen. There's the potential for it to do so. I actually don't think it's the most likely outcome in this campaign, but campaigns can have an effect and they have the potential to have that, make that difference.
So does it follow that in local election campaigns people don't necessarily vote on local issues in the way certainly the Lib Dems would have us believe? They vote for the party and the leader that they like.
It depends on timing, and it's certainly true that in some cases people vote on local issues, but they also decide not to vote at local elections when they decide to vote at the general election. And so that can make things very different.
How important to you is the issue of vote share? Because, again, if the seats were translated, or the local election gains were translated into seats, it wouldn't be quite the big majority that people have been talking about for the Tories.
I'm very wary of extrapolating between local and national election results. I agree with what's been said. You often get localised voting on local issues. The turnout is lower. And so while it may provide an indication of the way people are thinking, I would be, in my view, very, very careful about saying just because this has gone well or we did well at a local election, you're going to do well at a national election. The other thing is there's quite a long campaign and there's going to be a lot to be discussed. So my view is that, obviously, I feel buoyed up by what happened last week. Any Conservative is going to. But I certainly don't translate that into some sort of mathematical calculation as to what's going to happen in the general election. And I'm sure that it will not be a mathematical calculation that you can make.
In terms of the policies you were talking about, you think the more people hear those policies, the more popular Labour will become. What about seeing more of Jeremy Corbyn, which is also what the Labour Party is putting forward?
Jeremy is a very independent-minded person. He's got a lot of energy. He's running a much more energetic campaign,
and he's an asset as far as you're concerned.
And I believe that he is. He has a lot of really good values, and I think people like the fact that, as a kind of a committed person, he will not walk away in the way that David Cameron and George Osborne did. They walked away after 2 years. They broke the pact with the electorate that they had, and I think people are a bit tired of that. So I think as they
even though it hasn't shown so far in terms of his personal support,
we still have 4 weeks to go, and the other thing is we do have a lot of people. Whereas I think the Conservatives have a lot of money, we have a lot of people in terms of the doors that we can knock on, the conversations that we can have.
We've got a lot of people knocking on doors.
Not as many as I do.
Everyone's going to be knocking on doors.
Well, I'm in your constituency and you haven't knocked on my door. My grandma is in your constituency and you haven't knocked on her door.
Oh, well, there you go. There are some doors to knock on that.
Might have been busy out at work, but we've certainly knocked on a lot of doors in my constituency.
Jo Twyman, thank you for coming in. Now, let's get a roundup of all of today's other election news now. And here's Ellie Price. Ellie.
Jo, and welcome to Election Corner. Now, we find ourselves in something of an election sandwich this week. Last week we had the local elections. Next week we're expecting all the manifestos. So that we're stuck in the middle. But don't worry, there are plenty of tasty morsels and plenty of filling. Tim Farron is getting stuck into this election race. The fell-running Lib Dem leader showed he doesn't mind an uphill struggle at this fun-running Kendal. Then he got some orange stuff thrown at him.
Results!
And back to reality. Oh, there goes Ian Duncan Smith doing M&M.
He opens his mouth, but the words don't come out. He's choking now, everybody's joking now, and the clock's run out.
Don't give up the day job. I suppose that's what this election is all about. Meanwhile, Labour's Peter Kyle got the feline he ought to help out on the campaign trail and held a ladder while someone else saved a cat stuck on a roof. Labour's Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell says he doesn't think the capitalist system should be brought down in a communist revolution.
Are you a Marxist?
No. I believe there's a lot to learn.
No or a yes? I couldn't work it out.
Well, I tell you, I believe there's a lot to learn from reading Capital. Yes, of course it is, because that's been recommended not just by me but many others, mainstream economists as well.
UKIP want a one-in, one-out policy. No, they weren't at a swanky London nightclub, but a press conference talking immigration.
Zero net immigration over the next 5-year period.
And the things you can organise at a brewery. Nicola Sturgeon out in Perth pulled her obligatory campaign pint and doesn't like things to go to waste.
I've still got interviews to do. You can't anymore.
Now, All the party leaders are out this afternoon, and Election Corner will be here for the entire campaign. So if there's something you think we're missing, do tweet us on #BBCDP.
Ellie, thank you very much. Now, let's pick up on one of the stories that Ellie mentioned there, UKIP's immigration policy announced this morning. And we've been joined by the party's immigration spokesman, John Bickley. Welcome to the Daily Politics. As you know, immigration statistics are notoriously hard to collect. How much would it cost you and UKIP to institute this policy and get precise data on who is leaving and who is arriving?
Well, it would be a role for the Migration Control Commission. I mean, I find it interesting that this morning we hear from Theresa May yet again. She's going to promise to reduce immigration to tens of thousands.
So, and what are you promising?
Well, I'm reminded of the, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me 3, 4 times, shame on the Tory party.
And I've done that with Dominic Grieve, but I want to know more about your policy. I mean, you can't control the number of people leaving, can you? Or the nature of their skills and the experience that they take with them. So how would one in, one out work? Other than being a very
remember, the key here is that it's a rolling average over 5 years. So you give the Migration Control Commission a lot of flexibility on a rolling 5-year period to take into account annual variances. So rather than trying to dictate absolute numbers by particular sectors, you're taking a broad average look at this over a rolling 5-year period. So basically, what we're trying to say here is we need to get immigration under control. The British people clearly
under control, yeah. And what would that mean in terms of number? But what does that mean?
Well, we know for the last few years that the Tories have failed completely.
Sure, but what does it mean for you in terms of numbers? What would under control mean?
Well, we've said already at the moment we've got 600,000 people coming in there or thereabouts. Net is around 300,000 there or thereabouts. That's the size of a city of Newcastle coming in every year.
And your proposal is
net zero immigration. So we want
net zero immigration.
Net zero immigration. So basically, if 300,000 people leave, we want 300,000 people coming in. So it's, on average, over 5 years, it's flat. Now, Frank Field has been saying this for years, balanced migration.
How would you actually do it?
Because rather than pretending the politicians will do all this themselves because they never deliver, that's why we'd have a Migration Control Commission.
Right. How many people would be involved with this? I mean, it would be a massive expansion of government power to monitor down to every individual person who is leaving, what skills they may be taking and what you may need, even over a rolling period in any particular sector.
Well, there's the challenge for the political class, because they've failed miserably.
Right. But is it achievable? That's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to work out what the mechanics are.
I think it is achievable because other countries have a go at this and achieve it. You know, Australia for one. So if we're saying the
have they got a zero? Have they got a zero?
I don't know whether they have a zero. They want to grow their population. That's their own wish to do so, and they're a sovereign nation. They have that right to do. I mean, we're saying that it's politically correct for a government to state that they will deliver zero net migration over a rolling period.
Well, not if it's not achievable.
Of doing that, they should get out of power.
Right, and you say you can do it. What I'm trying to challenge you on is whether it is actually achievable. I'm not going to talk about whether it's desirable, but whether it's actually achievable. Yes. I mean, if 2 migrants had similar skills, for example, would your Migration Control Commission choose one over another based on their country of origin, for example?
No.
Well, how would you choose?
We're not interested in where people come from.
Yeah, but how would you choose?
Not interested. That's up to the Migration Control Commission to come up with a plan and a system for allowing us to balance migration.
Right.
That seems a reasonable way of moving this debate forward and delivering what the British people want. They've had enough of being lied to by the Tory party and the Labour Party, who keep promising them they're going to control immigration, and they don't.
But you want to ban all unskilled migration to the UK for 5 years. What do you think, what impact do you think that will have on certain sectors of the economy?
Well, maybe they'll start employing more British people.
But what immediate impact would it have?
Joe, remember, there's already hundreds of thousands of low-skilled immigrants in this country. We're not short of low-skilled immigrants.
Unemployment is not particularly high. If we look at the EU nationals, if you look at the EU nationals, they account for 31% of the workers in food manufacturing, 21% of those in hotels and other accommodation, 16% of those in agriculture, and 15% of those in warehouses. With the best will in the world, if on day one you sent those people home and you stopped you stopped those people coming in even over a 5-year period, what would happen to those economies?
Hold on. We haven't said anything about reducing the number of people already in this country. We actually would want to see a situation where everyone here from the EU who's been here up to the day Article 50 was triggered, is be able to stay here. Well, that needs to be done on the basis that the British people who reside in the EU 27 can also stay in the EU. We want those people to stay here. We want to say to the EU, let's have a sensible deal here where all the people from the EU are here, and that's over 3 million. We want them to stay here and continue to contribute to the British economy.
Right, but my question was, what impact would it have on those sectors I listed when you think of the percentage of EU nationals that account for the workforces there?
I don't think it'd have any impact at all. We've already said we'll issue seasonal agricultural visas, but expect those to come down over a period of time because we need to get more of our own people into work. And again, we have Theresa May talking the talk but failing to walk the walk. She's promised, along with Cameron, over the last 5 years to bring immigration down to the tens of thousands. That's 2 prime ministers, not some second-string civil servant.
No, and you've made that point. You've made that point. But can you name me a country in the Western world which aims to have zero net migration?
I'm not really interested in any other country.
Right. So there isn't one. There isn't one.
I'm interested in us doing the right thing for Britain.
Right. And you think it's desirable, intrinsically desirable, to have zero net migration?
That's what we've said. And the British people want to see migration brought down.
Right. John Bickley, thank you very much for coming in. Now, of course, whenever the country goes to the polls, a whole host of smaller parties get their candidates on the ballot paper. And throughout the campaign, we'll be taking a closer look at some of them. Today, it's the turn of the Yorkshire Party, who are currently fielding 23 candidates in the election. The Yorkshire Party was founded in 2014, originally as Yorkshire First. It has just over 2,000 Twitter followers. They're calling for a Yorkshire Assembly with powers similar to those of the Scottish Parliament. It wants to see increased school funding per pupil, a regional energy hub, and it wants Yorkshire to be able to set its own tax rates. They think Yorkshire Day, which is celebrated on August the 1st, should be a public holiday. And they want a Yorkshire team to be able to take part in the Commonwealth Games in 2022. And we've been joined from our Hull studios by the party's leader, Stuart Arnold. Welcome to the programme. You had candidates stand in the local elections last week. How did you do?
Not too bad at all, actually. They were our best results for the party in its short history. We got up to 33% in Doncaster, very narrowly failed to take a seat. But the portents are good, and we're in a very good position coming into the general election.
Right. So how many seats are you actually fielding candidates in the general election?
Well, as you say, we've got 23 penciled in, and I'm hoping that we get as far as 27. That's significant because that's double what we fought last time in 2015, and it's half the number of seats in Yorkshire, and I think that sends a real statement of intent as far as the party is concerned.
And what's your strong message going to be in that campaign?
Well, basically, we feel we're losing out. We're losing out on the devolution discussion that's going on at the moment. When we first started, the discussion was centred around Scotland and Wales and their parliaments and assemblies. And, of course, time has moved on. Last Thursday, we had elections for metro mayors in Manchester, Liverpool and various other parts of the country. And all this time, Yorkshire has been left behind. And it's not the fault of the people. They've just not been engaged in the process. It's the fault of local council leaders who can't agree the way forward. And I think the general election gives us the opportunity to put this argument front and centre and say, right, OK, now let's have a resolution on this. Where are we going with Yorkshire devolution?
And what's your judgment bid on the Northern Powerhouse, which, of course, George Osborne and the Conservatives talked about so much?
Well, I think it was a good idea. I'm not quite sure exactly what it means, but I think George Osborne did recognise that the UK economy is out of kilter. There's a fantastic potential in the north, not least in Yorkshire, which if we were able to unleash would improve the economy overall. It seems bizarre that London and the south east is really racing ahead and leaving the rest of the country behind. And it's this economic and political disconnect, which I think came through in the Brexit referendum, where, of course, in Yorkshire we voted overwhelmingly to leave.
Yeah, well, and picking up then on Brexit, because you point to Yorkshire having an economy twice the size of Wales. What is your party's position on Brexit?
Well, we allowed people to have a free vote ourselves, and as occurred in Yorkshire, most people did vote to leave. So what we're arguing for now is a kind of fair Brexit, a fair deal for Yorkshire.
And what does that mean?
Well, it means let's have an engagement, first of all, with the Prime Minister, because it took 10 months in a general election before she even visited Yorkshire since she was selected as Prime Minister, and that frankly is not good enough, and it's treating the people of Yorkshire with an amount of disdain. So we need to put our voice across, just as London, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and other places are, in terms of what we want for our farming sector, for our manufacturing sector, fishing and so on.
Do you expect a breakthrough in this election for your party?
I beg your pardon?
Do you expect a breakthrough in this election for your party?
Yes, we do. We do expect a breakthrough because I think the results from Doncaster showed there's a great potential for us. And I think with UKIP going off a cliff and Labour Party following them closely, I think we're in position to really begin to sweep some seats up.
All right, Stuart Arnold, thank you very much. There's just time before we go to find out the answer to our quiz. Can you remember the question? It was, who did Tim Farron have a poster of in his bedroom when he was a boy? Was it A, Che Guevara, B, Jacques Delors, C, Arthur Scargill or D, Margaret Thatcher? Your guesses?
Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, you know. How very good.
The Eurosceptic, Mr Farron.
Were you surprised?
No, not entirely. I mean, I can see that in youth he had wisdom, but he's lost it since.
And he is extraordinary with his Euroscepticism, isn't he?
Right, well, let's leave the Euroscepticism. I was going to ask you who you had on your wall when you were kids, but no, there's no time. That's it for today. Thanks to both of you for being our guests of the day. I'll be back with Andrew tomorrow. Bye.
When it came to my TV habits, I'd watch anything. Crazy, really.